family. Hello, Eden and Jerry. How are you? There's some people who are great strategic thinkers. There's some people in foreign policy and policy in general who know a lot of details, who can really understand each and every nut and bolt of the making of policy. Our guest today, Dr. Brzezinski, is somebody who falls in both camps. He has been both a strategic thinker, but somebody whose strategic vision is informed by a wealth of understanding of the facts on the ground. His new book is Strategic Vision, which is why I gave him that touting. It's America and the Crisis of Global Power. It talks about the whole concept of where the world is going with the West receding as a pure power center and why. But it also talks about some of the domestic issues in the United States. And it is our great pleasure to have you back in this room. This time, not just around a round table, but with a mob scene. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit about the thinking that went into this book.
Well, perhaps I could just take a few minutes to explain a little bit as to what the book is meant to do, and without going into too much detail, what its broad thematic thrust is. The title itself, Strategic Vision, is meant to suggest that when one is dealing with serious problems, particularly problems that are so complex as they are today on the global scale, one needs to have some sort of organizing notion of what one thinks is needed and should be done in the longer run, in addition to coping with the immediate problem. So strategic vision is not a blueprint, but it's an outline of what ought to be sought, in the conviction that doing so helps you also to deal with ongoing problems. The subtitle of the book is America and Global Power. It's not a book about America as a global power. It's about America and its relationship to global power. And here the thought is that in many respects, global power, particularly in this 21st century, is increasingly going to be dispersed. And that hence the notion of any one power acting as the global hegemon, as the only superpower, is unrealistic. I was struck in thinking about the last 20 or so years, the extent to which much of our public dialogue came to be dominated by the notion, as President George Bush II put it, that America has been chosen by God and commanded by history to be the dominant leader, hegemon in the world. Well, that illusion lasted for maybe a decade and a half or so, but not much longer than that. It isn't entirely George Bush's fault, although he has made a substantial contribution to the fact that this didn't prove to be so, particularly through his foreign policy. But it also has something to do with the sense of triumphalism and self-gratification and pride and greed that came to dominate American society after winning the Cold War. There was a kind of a sense, we made it, we avoided war, we triumphed. It's a good time to enjoy, to take advantage of it. And in that sense, the failure of that brief phase of American hegemony was a bipartisan accomplishment. My argument, more specifically now, is that we are in a century which is markedly different in terms of global dynamics, global geopolitics, from the previous several centuries. They were dominated by struggles for global supremacy. And the contenders were all Western powers. First naval powers, and then it shifted to domination of Eurasia, landmass powers, though with naval assets. And of course, the high point of these conflicts was the 20th century, when 3 times in the course of a single century, 3 world wars were fought, in the sense that there were worldwide participants in it. The Chinese played a role in World War I, which we tend to forget. Prior to that, there were struggles for global supremacy without being world wars between, let's say, the Portuguese and the Spaniards, the French and the Spaniards, the French and the British, then the Franco-British and the Germans, and so forth. We're now in a different age, and the reason we're in a different age involves, first of all, the shift of power from the West to the East, which means that the West is no longer so dominant and can't impose its domination. Secondly, it is very much connected with the rise of key Asian powers, and most notably China, as a possible contender to the United States, and especially so in the last 3 decades or so. And third, it is the byproduct of something I've become rather interested in over the last 15 years, the phenomenon that I call global political awakening. Namely, that for the first time, the public masses throughout the entire world have reached a stage of political consciousness and political activism which more or less achieves the standard set for the first time in human history, not by the American Revolution, which was an aristocratic and upper middle class revolution, but by the French Revolution, which was a popular revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité were its slogans. Slogans don't always describe reality. It was also a very brutal, very intolerant revolution, and a very passionate one, but one in which everyone participated. It was a revolution that affected not only the royalty and nobility, but also the church and the new bourgeois middle class and the peasantry. And it infused the masses with a sense of nationalism, which in the course of the 19th century spread from Europe to the Far East. In the course of First World War began to infect the colonial dominions because of the recruitment of soldiers from French colonies, from British colonies, to fight in Europe and to die in Europe, with the survivors going back and all of a sudden politically awakened. And in the course of the last century or so, it was also enhanced, in addition to these dynamics, by new means of mass communication. For the first time in the 30s, you could hear political leaders harangue their followers on the radio. That already transcended the borders. Then that was followed, as we all know, by television, then by the internet. And all of that has created a global mass that we see stirring everywhere with different degrees of intensity. And of course, our mass media are enthusiastic about it when it turns against dictators, and understandably so, but sometimes without too much discrimination, because not every mass upheaval is itself democratic. It is populist, but not democratic. But populist movements can be democratic, or can become democratic, as was in Central Europe, for example. I think we have much more of a question mark in that part of the world which today is being dominated by what we call the Arab Spring. It is a populist phenomenon, the outcome of which could be democracy, but it could be very intense, popularly supported dictatorships, fanaticism, dogmatism. And that is true elsewhere. Now, in that context, our ability to dominate it is limited, and it is furthermore limited by 2 considerations. One, our own social system has lost some of its global appeal and has been confronting increasing internal difficulties pertaining to its structural arrangements, to its sense of justice. For example, the whole question of social inequality, with America being one of the 3 worst offenders in the world in terms of social inequality, social income. It is also a societal problem, public ignorance, poor level of education, indifference to the world, ignorance about the world. And we, being a democracy, can have a foreign policy only as intelligent as the public's capacity to understand it. And unfortunately, in our society, that capacity is very limited. and that embarrassing circus in which our Republican candidates for presidents are engaging, in which they discuss foreign policy, is a symptom of that problem. When I hear some of them make flat commitments and declarations as to what they will do if they become presidents and how they might go to war, I tend to put them in two categories. Those who are actual idiots and believe what they're saying, and those who are cynical liars and are saying it because they believe that the public wants to hear it.
Which category do you put Romney?
Probably second.
Okay.
Probably second. So in that setting, that is a liability for us globally. Secondly, I think our foreign policy in recent years has entangled us in two prolonged wars, one of which was totally unnecessary and very costly, and the second one which was too long because of the excessively ambitious goals set for it, even though it was initially necessary. Now, in that context, I think there's a real problem that we face, namely that if we do not correct these internal problems, both domestic and foreign policy, we will be declining in influence, but I'm quite convinced that we will not be replaced by China in the foreseeable future, probably not in the lifespan of anyone in this room. The world will become more chaotic, but it won't become Chinese. And that is, in effect, one of the sources of our leverage. I think they know it. Once it's very senior.
Why won't it become more Chinese?
Because they don't have the capacity to do it. They don't have the doctrine. They don't have the outreach.
They don't have the economy, and they will have the military.
The economy is only one part of it, and military is one part of it. It has to be much more. The secret of the American appeal to the world was that it was systemically also something that appealed very much to the entire world, and we could project that. One Chinese leader said to me, when he was telling me how China is expanding, he then added, but please, please, don't let America decline too quickly. Because they know that. So it's in this context that division arises. I think what we need to do is, in addition to deal with our domestic problems, we need to, in our foreign policy, to try to create in the huge but central global continent, Eurasia, some degree of balance on the basis of larger platforms that can cooperate and address global problems. And this is why I say in the West, we have to have a policy that entices Turkey into the West, where it should be, and to which it has a lot to offer, and Russia, where it can be, if it democratizes, as I think it will, probably after a very negative interlude in the short run. And in the Far East, we ought to abstain completely from any war on the mainland. There's no war on the mainland between any Asian power, the outcome of which will be more grave to us than the consequences of our direct involvement in it.
But we're already fighting the longest war in our history on the Asian mainland.
That one should be finished. But I'm thinking about big wars and big powers. And here our relationship with China is critical. But we should manage it the way the British managed Europe during the 19th century, from the outside, and working closely with the Japanese, trying to promote Japanese-Chinese reconciliation, trying to mediate the Indian-Chinese potential conflicts, but without alliances or deep involvement. If we do that, I think then the century will be manageable. If we don't, then I think we're going to be living through growing global turmoil. And that is the basic choice we face.
You're particularly associated with Pakistan over the years. How do we restore some relationship there?
You know, I don't think we can insofar as it pertains to Afghanistan, because their concept of their national interest and their sense of what is at stake for them in Pakistan is divergent from ours. I think the most we can accomplish is disengagement in the next 2 or so years, hopefully facilitated by some transitional arrangement in parts of Afghanistan with the Taliban, and an external regional umbrella in which we succeed in engaging in a serious dialogue. The Iranians, the Pakistanis, the stans which border Afghanistan, and behind it, India, China, and Russia.
Was Afghanistan fundamentally a mistake?
No, it was a necessity with no choice because of the attack on us. We had to go in after al-Qaeda. We had a lot of goodwill in Afghanistan when we went in. The crowds cheered when we overthrew the Taliban. We had to destroy al-Qaeda. But the notion of building a modern democratic state was a chimera, which I think was a big mistake, and just engaged us in a protracted conflict in which there's no such thing as a victory.
So we should get out as quickly as possible?
Not as quickly as well, as quickly as possible. The question is what is possible. In other words, not pack up and try to leave pell-mell within a year or so.
Why not?
Because that will create far greater instability immediately, and there will be nothing left behind. I think we should strive to disengage while engaging in these two processes: discussions on the ground with the Taliban and the Kazakh government if it can, which we were starting to do in Qatar, and a regional conference modeled on 2002 conference in which the Iranians and the others that I've mentioned participated. But all of this will go to hell if in the meantime we get involved in a war with Iran, because if we get involved in a war in Iran, then a lot of the crises already at work in the Middle East will become merged into one. The conflict in Afghanistan, Pakistan will interact with the conflict with Iran. Iran will also destabilize Iran. That will link
Iraq.
it to Iraq. That will link it with the conflict in Syria. Who knows what will be happening in the Persian Gulf or between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
So what should we be doing with Iran's nuclear ambitions?
We should be patient and determined, as we proved that we can be and did during 40 years of the Cold War, when we could have been the victims of a blow-up in which 85 million Americans and Russians would die in 6 hours. And the fuse was very short. The time for reaction was dramatically short. I was woken up once. My job was to coordinate, to inform the president if there was a nuclear attack. And my military aide, a general, phoned me up and said, at 3 a.m., we're under attack. 220 Soviet missiles have been fired at the United States 30 seconds ago. And the president, had there been an actual attack, which obviously there wasn't because we wouldn't be here otherwise, would have from the 3rd to the 7th minute to make his decision how he responds. In the middle of the night, out of the blue. We never know how a president would respond. This is not the situation with Iran. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. It is not in the process right now of acquiring them. I think there's overwhelming consensus on this by serious people, not people with a case to make, but serious people. AAI, our intelligence, even the Mossad. And so we have time to deal with it. We have to find a formula in which the choice that is given them is not either strangulation or humiliating capitulation. Because if that's what we offer them, then we're not going to get an agreement.
So we could allow them the concept of having a bomb? And
no, what we could allow them is full acquiescence with the NPT, which is a nuclear program subject to comprehensive inspections with the right to enrich up to 5%. All of that they're entitled to do. They're doing it. There are suspicions they may be doing more, but not more than that. And consensus that if they are doing more than that, they're doing it so surreptitiously that it imposes delays on their ability to acquire weapons, which means there is time.
I mean, as you say, there's argument on that. You say serious people understand. But let me just ask you, if it were the case that they were really pursuing a nuclear weapon, would you change your approach?
No, it wouldn't. I didn't favor an attack on the Soviet Union. General LeMay, for example, did. And there are people like him right now arguing regarding Iran. I didn't favor an attack on China to prevent the Chinese from having nuclear weapons.
But we allowed both of them to have nuclear weapons and pursued
deterrence.
A policy of deterrence and containment.
Credible deterrence.
Could we do that with Iran? Allow them to have a nuclear weapon and pursue a policy of deterrence and containment?
Of course. I mean, we're so manifestly many more times powerful than they. The disproportion is just incredible. Look, we have lived...
But do you think they would respond to a policy of deterrence the way the Soviets
would? What would they do? Unless you
allow other people to have nuclear weapons.
That's not so simple. Anyone who says that doesn't know anything about nuclear weapons.
Me, I guess.
Yeah. You know, nuclear weapons.
Well, the AQCON model.
Well, that's a comprehensive program of assistance. That's not just slipping somebody a nuclear weapon.
I didn't mean that. Yeah.
It's, you know, nuclear weapons are like little babies. They need tender, loving care. If you don't deal with them nicely and in an expert fashion, one, they'll become unreliable, which means most likely they will not work. Or alternatively, they'll blow up in your face.
Why is it that even the Obama administration does not believe containment could work?
He's talking about containment in a different sense. Containment of regional ambitions. That is to say, yes, if they use their muscle to try to assert themselves in the region, we will not permit them to do that. We will not permit them to threaten the Persian Gulf states. We don't want them to become preeminent in Syria, although containment there may be more difficult to effect because it's one of those situations which we don't have the option for very open, evident military intervention. So that's a complicated problem. But the fact is, we can make life miserable for them indefinitely, ruin their economy, and at the same time, make it very clear to them, and I favor this, that any threat from Iran directed at any state in the Middle East, including, of course, Israel, will be viewed by the United States as a threat against the United States, requiring a proper response. Incidentally, there is an example of that going on right now. Neither Japan nor South Korea have nuclear weapons. North Korea has nuclear weapons. It has defied the international community. It has tested them through explosions. It has delivery systems. And yet neither the Japanese nor the South Koreans are screaming that we ought to go to war against North Korea, nor are threatening to do so themselves. And they feel reasonably secure. So I don't buy this threat that somehow or other the Iranians are crazy. A country that has endured successfully for 2,500 years is not a country of messianic maniacs. They are difficult, and they're obnoxious. They're sometimes less than truthful, to put it mildly. But that's normal in international diplomacy.
So you basically disagree with the Obama administration's clear line that they've drawn?
I don't think it's a clear line.
Oh, okay. But they say the president
I think it's an intelligent line, which is a war is not necessary. The president has said that. The president has said that we mustn't be blustering. Now, he said that pointing it in his public comments at the Republican candidates. But I strongly suspect that the radius of his remarks was meant to be wider. Yeah. That is to say, look, our military have said this openly. If the Israelis strike Iran, the easiest retaliation by the Iranians will not be Israel. They can't really hit it. It will be our troops in Afghanistan. Any orderly disengagement will become impossible. They'll hit out at Iraq, which is vulnerable. Through Iraq, they can reach Syria. They can hit out at the Persian Gulf states. They can affect the cost of oil. Look, the $5 that we'll soon be paying for a gallon of gasoline, and we're already paying $4, is a form of a Netanyahu tax on oil, because he pumped up the issue of war. Insurance rates immediately shot up for the transport of oil, and the price of oil has risen. This is extremely damaging to all of us and unnecessary.
So what should be our policy to Israel then?
I think candor and friendship and credibility. And we should be able to sustain that. I think we have been with them over the years. We have held them fantastically. There are no other country that receives as much money per capita basis as Israel. No country has received as much weaponry as they have.
Pushing harder than we have for now 12 years for a peace with the Palestinians, or is that an irrelevancy?
Well, my own view has been, and I've stated many times publicly, that on the basis of experience which I've had over the last 30 years, neither the Palestinians nor the Israelis by themselves can ever reach peace. The Palestinians are too weak, too fragmented to make meaningful concessions. The Israelis are too strong, too self-confident, but also politically fragmented to make meaningful concessions. It needs a party that is respected by both sides and that has some concept of a compromise solution to push the peace process forward. There's no one else except the United States that can do that. And I think if we do that, it will be immediately better for the region. It will give the Palestinians a stake in a meaningful reality. It will give the Israelis not only immediate peace, because they have it and they're strong enough to have it, so they don't really need it, but it will begin the process of making Israel an integral and enduring part of the Middle East, in which within 20 years or so, I can envisage the two, Israel and Palestine, in effect together, becoming the equivalent of Singapore in the Middle East, the source of innovation, capital, and everything else. These days, I've been to Israel a number of times. I've been in the Middle East a number of times. When you used to go to Tel Aviv, you saw a modern city, and the rest kind of semi-developed. Today, you go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, and you see a modern city, and you see kind of an old-fashioned urban industrial city in Tel Aviv. Israel could be part of the success, but only as an integral part of that, and not as a source of great animus for the Arabs, part of which goes back historically, part of which is instrumental, part of which is derived from a sense of frustration in the days in which everybody has their own state, except the Palestinians.
And finally, before we go to the audience, China. You talk in the book about the illusions we had on China, and yet some of those illusions seem to still persist, right, on whether China is going to be a competitor, to what extent it's going to be part of a multipolar system.
Well, sure, and that's understandable. I mean, after all, since 1945, we have been in the forefront of things. One might even argue since 1920, when we were initially first involved in the creation of League of Nations, and then we pulled back. And of course, we reached the apex in 1990. Our reaction to China right now is to some degree, reminiscent of our reaction to Japan in the 1990s. Remember the panic in this country and the sort of resentment and almost racial animus about the unfair Japanese doing us in, particularly when they bought the Rockefeller Center. Now they can't get rid of it, and they want to. So some of it is that. But some of it is rational in the sense that I think it is reasonable to at least entertain the probability that within the next decade, in a number of critical economic indices, the Chinese will surpass us. And political power is in part derived from economic power. And therefore, how we structure their relationship with us, how we impact on Asia, I think is going to be quite critical in establishing whether international politics can reach a new phase. I once had a debate with John Mearsheimer about America and China, and he very effectively made the case that conflict between us and the Chinese is inevitable. And he reinforced it with the proposition that that is a cardinal principle of international politics theory, that when two rivals arise, they collide. And he cited from history.
Peloponnesian
Britain,
War
France,
or something.
exactly, all the way to Germany,
Right.
Imperial, the Nazi, and the Soviets, and so forth. My response to him was, well, first of all, as far as the imperative of the theory of international politics is concerned, what is theory? Theory is a generalization based on the past. Therefore, if it doesn't happen next time, you have to change your theory. And then it'll be a new theory. So the real question is it bound to happen or it might not happen? And I think in the age of one, global turmoil, to which we're all vulnerable, of nuclear weapons, which makes a central major war unproductive in terms of its consequences, I think there is a chance that with intelligence, both we and the Chinese can accommodate.
But I would posit that maybe we're already starting a small-scale war, not just on economics, but a cyber war that's been going on now. Do you worry at all, or do you think that's relevant at all, the cyber war that's been happening at the fringes with China?
No, I think that's very important, and I think we have to be able to so to speak, fight it or to negate it. And you do that also by negotiating, but also by imposing costs on those who do it, by doing a little bit of it to them, so they begin to appreciate the fact they can be vulnerable too. But it also operates, on the public level. We do live now in an age in which the public, more so for us than in China, but in China there is a middle class now that's more assertive. What people think is important. And I think we have to be very careful not to demonize the Chinese. And the Chinese have to be very careful not to demonize us in reciprocity. I attended the dinner for he's Vice President. Vice President Xi, he's going to be the next president, given by Secretary of State Clinton and Vice President Biden. And I sort of had an uneasy feeling as it unfolded, because we sat there, the dinner started at 12:30. Lunch at 12:30. Soup was served at 2:25. I finally had to leave at 2:35, so I don't know what happened afterwards. But I suppose there was a further course. But the reason it took so long was the secretary greeted him very effusively, which was then translated into Chinese. The ratio of time is 1.5 longer in Chinese than in English, so that made it much longer. Then the vice president made a speech. He's always very eloquent. That was translated 1.5 ratio. She had to stand there and listen to it. Most of Biden's speech was a criticism, a series of charges of how the Chinese are taking advantage of us. And I sort of said to myself, gee, how would he feel if he was the state guest in China and had to stand there for about an hour to listen to these speeches? How would he react? Anyway, she reacted by reading his prepared speech. So he didn't take it into account. But the Chinese mass media are beginning to reciprocate. And there is now a tone of triumphalism in them and some sort of schadenfreude about their emphasis on our decline, which is a little premature. And that can be dangerous. But I think we, on the whole, still realize that the real task internationally is for us and the Chinese to find a formula in which we can work together. Because if we don't, then none of the global or regional problems that we're now going to be confronted with in the course of the century are going to be addressed effectively. And when they're not, I think the consequences are predictable.
Great. Yes, Judith. And then Tim, and then, Ode.
Dr. Brzezinski, as always, thank you very much. Since the end of the Cold War, and our structure of government was basically designed for the bipolar world, it seems to me that government is redundant. They haven't reorganized to face a world of transnational threats where mainly multilateral approaches are required. So it ends up that the military is an institution that functions, and they're doing everything. They did in Iraq, they are doing in Afghanistan in particular. Do you think that our foreign policy making and defense establishment needs to be reorganized or reformed in some way to be able to respond to the challenges you spoke about?
Well, Judith, I'm not quite sure how you would respond except through the Defense Department in the case of Afghanistan. A lethal attack was launched on us from Afghanistan. The only response in those circumstances that could be undertaken was going in, trying to liquidate Al-Qaeda, and to overthrow the regime that gave it an umbrella. So I don't think that is a fair criticism. On the other points, I really don't think structure is as serious a problem as understanding and ability to marshal public support for intelligent responses. And I think that involves much more a relationship between the president and the public. The public, as I've said earlier, is very ignorant, by and large, knows nothing about world history, practically nothing about geography, and it can't respond intelligently, and makes public debate about foreign policy a field there for demagogy and for demagogues. And this is why the sort of neocon phenomenon has been able to stir up public support. I think that's one area where things should be changed, and the way to respond, first of all, is to exploit the bullet pulpit that the president has. This is a very intelligent guy who, my sense of him is, understands the problems of the 21st century. I'm not quite sure that he's institutionally, personally ready to be assertive in responding, but he understands them. I think he ought to talk more to the American people about these problems. His speeches on world issues have been given in Istanbul, in Cairo, in Prague, in Berlin, but not in the United States. His speeches in the United States deal with healthcare or fundraising, or other things.
Jobs, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me.
So that's one problem. The other area, let me just finish on this,
Sure.
is something that I do feel strongly about. Amazing as it may seem, we don't have a policy planning mechanism for our foreign policy that deals with foreign policy writ large. The Defense Department plans defense policy, and its view is that that is really foreign policy. The State Department has a policy planning council. Quite naturally, it thinks that foreign policy is diplomacy, plus the Secretary of State herself or himself. The National Security Council has a small segment dealing with national security policy and drafts an annual statement. But there is no ongoing serious mechanism that engages in real global policy planning and bridges the gap that is inherent in our separation of powers, engages in it in some informal fashion, the leadership of the Congress. And that, I think, is a major gap.
Other than the Aspen Strategy Group, yes.
That's right, during the nice summer holidays.
Zbig, nice to see you, and thanks for your insights and your vision here this afternoon. I have two questions. One is about better information and education for the American people. I flew from Delhi to Lucknow and drove out of Lucknow 2 hours and spoke at a Muslim school. And these wonderful young people, 7th and 8th graders, and their parents attended, so there were probably 700 or 800 people in the audience. And the first young lady stood up to ask a question, and she said, "Mr. Ambassador, we know that President Obama is Christian, not Muslim. Why do so many Americans believe that he is a Muslim? What is it in America that encourages this misinformation?" So my first question to you is, what specifically would you recommend, and I know you've thought about this, high school, college, social media, how do we better educate our citizens about the politics and about foreign policy?
And I'm going to cut you there because there are about 5 other questions. I'll come back to you for your
Okay,
second
if I can squeeze in the second one, that'd
later.
be great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, briefly on Obama, let me just offer you a hypothesis. A lot of the people who are making it such an issue that he is a Muslim probably would have preferred to be able to say that he's a black, but that is no longer tolerable socially. So this is kind of a back door of getting at him, in addition to anti-Muslim prejudices. On the larger issue, look, we don't have geography classes in most of our secondary schools, not to mention primary schools. We don't teach world history. We have a public that doesn't follow the news or reads good newspapers. Our mass media are not doing their job. Look at the evening news on the 3 networks. But 45 seconds of latest news, preferably some sensation, somebody got killed somewhere or something like that. And after that, advice on health, some social trivia, something from Hollywood, things of this sort. I mean, we do have a public that is just not educated about foreign affairs. And that will require massive effort in a decentralized federal system in which it cannot be dictated from the top down.
Ode, and then here, but let me start with you. Yeah.
Dr. Brzezinski, you talked about China and the rise in the Chinese power and Chinese potential to be involved in global regional issues. You didn't say much about Russia. And what's the role of Russia in the current problems we have all over, in view of the fact that the Russians are blocking a UN Security Council on Syria? And how do you see the Russian-Syrian relationship?
Well, I certainly don't approve of the reaction to the Syria resolution. I think it's highly regrettable. But at the same time, one has to face the fact that the Russians have had traditional ties with Syria and interests. And if we want to have a common policy, we have to find a formula that makes it possible to have a common policy, not simply move in a direction in which we seem to be tempted by the notion that Assad is somewhat similar to Gaddafi and Syria is somewhat similar to Libya, neither of which is accurate. So this is a much more complicated issue than it has so far been presented to the public. Insofar as Russia itself is concerned, I deal with that at some length in my book. My view is that in the short run, the relationship is going to deteriorate because of Putin. In the long run, his kind of regime is doomed. And if he protracts it, he will hurt Russia very badly because the internal stagnation and decay will get out of hand. But there is in Russia now an emerging civic society that's middle class, increasingly cosmopolitan. And we can build on that. And this is why I feel reasonably confident in advocating that in some fashion we now begin to strive, at least to have the door open and then to engage the Russians in deeper participation in the Euro-Atlantic community, which I think is needed for the larger reasons that I outlined in my initial introductory comments.
Mm-hmm. Right here.
Dr. Brzezinski, the first time I met you was in Tehran. I was in the cabinet and I was the official host of the Carter visit. And I know now that you say that these Iranians are obnoxious and not quite truthful, I know going back to that day that you don't mean all Iranians, you mean the mullahs. So that said, I'm now heading an organization that works in 20 countries with women. And they're mostly Muslim majority countries. And we're running across the situation of no civic society organizations that are strong, no viable parties, no media that is reliable, and so forth and so on. Now, I know that kind of thing will one day soon, if hopefully soon, happen in Iran as well and in other countries. Is there a way that the Western policy toward these countries, specifically the United States, could be a little more proactive in both diplomatic pressure and also strengthening these organizations and sort of foreseeing what we suddenly wake up one morning and have to confront? Because as you said, the tendency is that then we'll have autocratic governments that are supported by the population, right now 70% in Egypt, and how do you fight the kind of government that is backed by 70% of the people? So is there something we can do that is preventive of these cases which are bound to happen?
Well, my sense is that a great deal of what you wish would be happening is something that motivates Secretary Clinton in the State Department, and I think a really serious effort is being made in the State Department to generate American involvement and commitment in what might be called the gender revolution around the world. Talking more specifically of Iran, I'll also add that in Iran, at least in my view, and you certainly know Iran better than I do, we underestimate the degree to which women are terribly important in Iran. And we have this sort of primitive notion that all of the Iranian women are sort of covered in black and are kept as semi-slaves at home. Whereas, in fact, in the urban society in Iran, my impression is women are very important, in many respects dominant, more numerous than men in some of the professions, more numerous than men in universities. And this is one of the reasons why I'm convinced that if we avoid a conflict with Iran, we will begin to separate Iranian nationalism from Iranian fundamentalism, and particularly in the urban areas, because the basic statistics indicate that Iran has the same degree of social readiness for a real transformation as Turkey. If you just look at all the different aspects of society. I think a policy of confrontation with Iran is the policy most likely to produce a protracted union of Iranian nationalism with fanaticism, with perhaps destructive consequences for the entire region and ultimately for us.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Size 87, I wanted to ask a question, a little bit of a follow-up, gentlemen, about the Russia question. You said that there would be that short period of turmoil and maybe a decline in democracy in Russia. I think that's my interpretation of it. I also didn't hear you mention India very much, so I'm curious about your perspective on that part of the world, because India will overtake China in population. And the last thing is, I would like to hear your prescience about Latin America. You didn't mention the region at all. It's probably in your book. I haven't read it, but I just...
Why don't we let Dr. Brzezinski pick one or two of those, but and then, yeah.
Yeah, well, on Russia, I said what I had to say, and I say much more in the book. On Latin America, I don't say much because I'm concerned about global dynamics, and Latin America, while important in its own right, is not at the center of the social forces that are transforming the world, whereas Eurasia is, and specific regions in Eurasia are particularly unstable and dangerous. As far as India is concerned, well, we have our former ambassador here, so I hate to speak in his presence. But I am more skeptical about India. I think it's an amalgam that is yet to define itself in terms of modern standards. Its democracy, widely admired, and rightly so, is at the same time, to some extent, an epiphenomenon. That is to say, it doesn't define the reality of Indian life. It's a little bit like British democracy in the 1870s. That is to say, an aristocratically controlled pseudo-democracy. It's a country in which the rates of literacy are staggeringly high. It is a country in which the across-board socioeconomic comparisons on a per capita basis with China are manifestly detrimental to India's standing. In other words, it's a country in which its problems are still to be faced. And last but not least, it is a country in which there are wide-ranging differences involving millions and millions of people pertaining to language, religion, and ethnicity. And that is yet to be tested in terms of the viability of the Indian Union. So, yes, India has great potential, but also great potential for trouble, internal trouble.
Yeah. I'm going to get back to you so you can both answer and then do your second question, but yeah, let me get everybody else in.
Thank you. Dr. Brzezinski, particularly during the budget debates, we're talking about the defense budget and talking about the ability of the military to continue a policy of being able to conduct two wars simultaneously, two-war policy. At the same time, what we've seen over the last couple of years is not conventional warfare, but more what's called now asymmetrical warfare, which used to be called irregular warfare and small wars, and you can go on and on. What do you think the future of warfare is? Is it more on the asymmetrical side? Is it more conventional? And should we be spending the kind of resources that we do to maintain an army that can basically conduct two wars simultaneously?
Well, actually, we have in our force posture statement been shifting to one war, plus some military action, but not on a scale of a war. I don't know how you define these things because I don't know how you make that choice. Suppose we get into a war with Iran, directly or indirectly, and suppose something breaks out on the Korean Peninsula. Are we then going to say, well, it's written in the force posture statement, we're going to fight one war, so I guess we have to pick one of these and bug out, right? I don't think it's a solution. I mean, we may or we may not be forced by circumstances. Yeah, well, obviously that's budget implications, but budget implications may be produced by circumstances. That is to say, if we decide that we can't afford to lose South Korea and Japan, we may have to fight two wars. It would be a disaster if we had to, in many respects. But the point is, these kinds of planning exercises, in my judgment, involve too much rigidity in a volatile world. But on the main issue, I think we are more likely to have kind of sporadic conflicts, which can be called people's wars or asymmetrical warfare or whatever. Wars which are not fought in order to be totally won. Wars in which we don't use the totality of our resources to prevail. Wars in which there are still massive restraints of a political character operating on the level of violence. The hope is that if we can operate in a world in which we have larger international accommodation on specific issues with other powers, the threat emanating from such local wars escalating into regional wars can be contained. And that is the political calculation here.
Sir, how you understand the unexpected revolution in Egypt by American circle policymakers and think tanks while there is great involvement of the United States in Egypt? And how do you understand the rejection of Washington circle for the outcome of the first free election in Egypt, which produced above 70% of Islamic forces in the parliament?
I didn't get the question. Did you?
Well, could you sort of repeat it again, where it's a little hard to hear it up here? Or stand up, yeah.
United States involvement in Egypt is huge in the last 30 years at least, and in the same time, U.S. circles and intelligence and think tanks didn't expect the revolution last year. That's first part, how you understand it, how come we missed it here? And second, how do you understand the rejection of Washington circles of the outcomes of the first free election in Egypt, which produced 70% Islamic-dominated parliament and most likely will present a first Islamic president in few months as well?
Well, as far as the first is concerned, we didn't expect the revolution. My sense is that Mubarak didn't expect it either. And you know, he's there. These revolutionary events are usually unexpected. That's why they happen.
That's why they're called revolutions.
Yeah, precisely. So that doesn't bother me. Someone
Although, on a larger sense, do you think American intelligence has kind of missed a whole lot more than they should have missed, starting with Russia's collapse to the Arab Spring?
Well, Russia's collapse was probably an event that was so much a byproduct also of individual subjective errors by the top leaders that it was very hard to anticipate. I mean, if you look at the amalgam of reforms that Gorbachev set in motion, they just didn't add up. Now, whether the intelligence should have had the guts to say this will collapse, you know, look, when Shushkevich of Belarus, Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Yeltsin of Russia met and decided to unseat Gorbachev and to announce the dissolution of the Soviet Union, how much would you have bet on the proposition that they'll be arrested and not allowed to carry it out? But instead, Gorbachev accepts it and resigns. You know, predictability.
I didn't mean to get you off on the history.
Yeah.
It just seems that, to get back to the gentleman's question, not only did we miscalculate what was happening in Egypt, we kind of missed the whole notion of the Arab Spring. Are we fundamentally missing some, not just in our national intelligence, but our collective wisdom about this region, what's happening?
I don't think so. I mean, it seems to me that we're dealing here with social forces that then create unexpected political consequences. But the emanation of these social forces is, in many cases, the byproduct of a single event that's inherently unpredictable. For example, take the Tunisian guy who set himself on fire.
And had that not happened, you think the Arab Spring would not have happened?
Maybe not. Maybe not. We don't know. We'll never know that. But the point is, it provoked a massive, spontaneous, personal human reaction. I mean, that's the essence of humanity. It's always possible to analyze certain trends in broad categories, but predicting specific events really is a prophetic exercise rather than an intelligent exercise.
And then his second part was, the elections have happened, and yet the United States seems uncomfortable with accepting them.
Well, because we're concerned as what does it mean that if it becomes a state dominated by Islamic precepts. Our experience so far in that respect has been mixed. We have had good relations over the years, tinged with some suspicions and misunderstandings with Saudi Arabia. But we have had obviously a very negative relationship with a highly Islamist fundamentalist regime in Iran. So it remains to be seen. Egypt is a country, however, with long enduring political traditions and a sense of its own worth and importance in the region. And I think that is, on the whole, a source of some degree of restraint and provides some basis for some degree of modest predictability.
Yes. Okay, yes, Diana.
Could you comment on the impact of the Trilateral Commission in today's world?
Well,
And then the
I was involved in shaping it, and I was its first director. And the idea behind it was that in addition to the Euro-Atlantic relationship, we ought to engage the Japanese in a collective sense of responsibility for the common weal, for the global weal. And I think in that respect, it was an innovative and useful initiative. I think over time, it lost some of its policy momentum. And in a report that I wrote on that subject, actually, at one stage, I said that the Trilateral Commission is very prestigious, but not influential.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Dr. Brzezinski, I'd like to ask you about your comments regarding Turkey and the idea that Turkey should be brought more into the West. Turkey, as everyone knows, has been gravitating more towards a somewhat more Islamist sentiment, which puts Turkey in a greater position, some people believe, to play a leadership role within Islam than it played when it was gravitating more towards the West. Do you think that if Turkey is brought more into the West, it will diminish its prospect that it could play that role in Islam and perhaps help bring stability to the Middle East and other Islamic regions?
Well, you said that most people are aware of the fact that Turkey is gravitating towards Islamism. I have to confess that if you were right, then I'm in the minority because I haven't noticed that. I think by and large, Turkey is a really remarkably successful example of a country that in the course of a 100-year-long sustained effort, ever since Atatürk's reforms of 1923, has been able to transform that society to a degree far in excess of the internal transformation, for example, in Soviet Russia. If you compare the social statistics for the two countries, the Turks are ahead of the Russians in many domains that pertain to social evolution. And I think Erdogan and his party right now on a number of issues, be it Syria or Iran or the general role of religion in a secular state, is in the forefront of hopeful change, not only insofar as Turkey itself is concerned, but in terms of the Islamic world as a whole. So I think the progress the Turks are making is impressive, and that validates, in my view, the proposition that having Turkey part of the West, rather than in some fashion hostile to it or volatile internally, is the best course of action.
Mm-hmm. And let me end then, getting back to you, with either to comment on India or if that was not your second question.
Well, I'll comment on India and then try to sneak a second question into Dr. Brzezinski. On India, I don't disagree at all with the list that Dr. Brzezinski put forward. I just wouldn't put them all into the challenges category. I'd put many of them into the opportunities category. I think India is helping on foreign policy with respect to Myanmar. That's been a success story so far. I think they're reaching out positively to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. The talks with Pakistan, while quiet, have gone fairly well. And Dr. Singh has some initiatives with respect to Afghanistan that share our strategic interests there. So, you know, as a young democracy, 60 years old, I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to engage India commercially, economically, and with the strategic interests of the Indian Ocean. You know, they're a glide paths for both the U.S. and India to work on. My last question for Dr. Brzezinski would be, with an election coming up and several months away, if you were sitting in the White House, what three issues would you be most attuned to and worried about? And then what surprise might you be looking at in addition to that list of three?
What, you don't have to only do international. You can do domestic.
Well, the surprise internationally, that would be very perplexing, would be an outbreak of war between Israel and Iran, in the wake of which we would be also a victim of that event. And that probably is, in terms of surprise, that could be a game changer, yes. Because I suspect that no matter what the stakes are, any Republican candidate for president, given the list that is available, and I don't think it's going to be anybody else, is going to endorse it enthusiastically. And the American public will not feel the costs, the negative costs of that, until several weeks later, at the earliest. So that, I think, could be a game changer. But that, in my view, if anything, fortifies the case that the president ought to be clear and explicit in making the argument that this is not good for the region, this is not good for the United States. If it's not good for the United States in the long run, it's not good for Israel either. And I think that case can be made very plausibly in a perfectly friendly fashion. And I think compellingly, because the majority of the American Jewish community is not for war, the majority of Israelis are not for war, and the majority of Americans are not for war. And that's something that the president could mobilize. In terms of domestic issues, well, I think the ones the president is addressing is the right issues. They do pertain to productivity, to jobs, but also to social justice. You cannot be a totally successful democracy if you only go out for the maximization of growth and of wealth, and especially if that wealth is then very asymmetrically shared. I think the fact that absolutely no one in America has paid any serious price for the disgraceful failures and abuse of the financial system, which really verge on fraud, and in terms of social consequences are very destructive. I think that is a very, very major fault.
Dr. Brzezinski, the book is Strategic Vision. Our friends at Politics and Prose are selling it. He will stay to sign it and answer further questions. Thank you. Incredibly enlightening.
Very good. You're running the show.
Well, we had a good audience. I mean, a good audience of people who were
It's 1:15 right now.
Yeah, is that all right? Good timing?
Yeah, but I want to make it clear that I'm just going to sign. I'm not going